Have you ever wondered what happens when a man who has spent his entire life balancing the books decides that the most important ledger in his life has been tampered with? It is not a scene of shouting, throwing chairs, or dramatic outbursts. It is not the kind of thing you see in movies where the hero loses his temper and throws a punch. No, true vengeance, the kind that leaves a mark on the soul, is a quiet, surgical procedure. It happens in the silence between heartbeats. It happens when you look across a polished mahogany table and see a man realize that the game he thought he was playing has ended before he even took his first move. Mark was sitting in that chair, his tie undone, the knot hanging loosely around his neck like a noose he had tied himself. His hands were shaking, just a little, the kind of tremor that only appears when you realize you are no longer the smartest person in the room. He was staring at the manila folder in front of me, with the kind of terror that people usually reserve for natural disasters. He looked at me, hoping for a flicker of anger, a sign that I was irrational, emotional, or predictable, but I gave him nothing. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, savoring the warmth, and checked my watch. I was not there to yell. I was there to balance an account that had been left in the red. People often ask me why I am the way I am, so cold, so detached, so observant. It is a byproduct of 40 years spent as a forensic accountant. I spent my life auditing shadows. I worked for the kind of firms that Fortune 500 companies call when money goes missing, when ledgers refuse to reconcile, and when someone thinks they are clever enough to hide a fraud behind layers of shell companies and offshore accounts. In my line of work, you learn a fundamental truth about human nature. People are lazy. They think they are being sophisticated, but they leave trails. They make mistakes. They get arrogant. I have spent decades looking at spreadsheets until the numbers start to dance before my eyes, and every time, I found the truth hidden in the margins. It is a profession that turns you into a cynic, but it also gives you a superpower. I don't see people. I see patterns. I see entries and exits. I see risk and liability. But for all my expertise in professional coldness, I had one weakness. It was a person, not a ledger. My late wife, Sarah, was the only entry in my life that never required a calculation. She was the one thing that was purely, beautifully, and dangerously human. When she passed, the world lost its color, and I found myself living in a house that felt too large and far too quiet. I kept her things exactly where she left them. Her vanity, her books, her letters, and most importantly, her jewelry. That jewelry wasn't just gold, diamonds, and gemstones. It was a timeline of our life together. The small silver band from our humble beginning, the pearls from our anniversary in Paris, the sapphire pendant that marked the birth of our daughter. Each piece was a chapter of our history. It was the only part of her I could still touch, the only physical proof that we had built something lasting in this fleeting world. Then, life dealt me a blow that I didn't see coming, the only kind of risk assessment I hadn't prepared for. My health took a turn. It was a sudden, sharp, and terrifying medical crisis. For 3 weeks, I was in the hospital, hooked up to machines that beeped in a rhythm that felt like a countdown clock. I was weak, disoriented, and completely dependent on those around me. I had no choice but to rely on my son-in-law, Mark. He was the one who held the keys. He was the one who looked after the house. He was the one I trusted to keep the world together while I was busy fighting to stay in it. I gave him a limited power of attorney, a simple act of trust, believing that he understood the weight of the responsibility he was taking on. I thought he was a man of character. I thought he cared about my daughter, about our family, and about the legacy of the woman who had welcomed him into our lives with open arms. I was wrong. I see that now, not with anger, but with the clinical clarity of a man looking at a flawed balance sheet. While I was lying in that hospital bed, struggling to breathe, Mark was looking at my life and seeing only assets to be liquidated. He wasn't looking at my wife's jewelry as a collection of memories. He was looking at it as currency. He was looking at it as a way to solve his own problems, to cover his own failures, to buy himself a temporary reprieve from his own poor decisions. He didn't just steal from me. He stole from the dead. He violated the sanctity of the one place where I felt safe. And the worst part, the part that truly offended my professional sensibilities, was that he thought I would never notice. He thought that because I was old, because I was sick, and because I was grieving, I wouldn't have the capacity to track him down. He underestimated me. He treated me like a broken calculator, but he forgot that the machine still works perfectly, even if it is a little older than the new models. He was about to learn that when you steal from an accountant, you aren't just committing a crime, you are inviting an audit that you cannot possibly survive. When I finally returned home from the hospital, the house felt like a spreadsheet that had been corrupted. It was quiet, far quieter than a house should be. I was still weak, my hands steady only by sheer force of will, but my mind was as sharp as it had been on my first day of auditing decades ago. I moved through the hallway, noticing the subtle shifts in the environment. Mark had been house-sitting. He had been entrusted with the security of my sanctuary, yet there was a lingering dissonance, a lack of alignment that only a trained eye would catch. I went straight to the bedroom. It was the only room that mattered. I approached the dresser, where the velvet-lined jewelry box sat, a small, unassuming piece of furniture that held the history of 40 years of marriage. On the surface, nothing seemed out of place. The box was closed, dust-free, and positioned exactly where it had always been. But to an accountant, the surface is never the story. The story is in the ledger, and here, the ledger was the arrangement of the contents. I opened the lid. The interior was pristine, almost too pristine. I noticed the spacing of the necklaces and the rings. There was a specific pattern Sarah had always followed, a chaotic but deliberate order that only she understood. She had a habit of placing her daily wear to the left and her formal pieces to the right. As I scanned the velvet slots, I saw it. The variance. The gaps were too uniform, too carefully adjusted to hide the absence of the missing items. Mark hadn't just taken the jewelry. He had tried to reorganize the remaining pieces to mask the theft. He had been playing a game of shell and pea, assuming that a sick, tired old man wouldn't notice the difference in weight or the slight misalignment of the display. It was an insult to my intelligence, but more importantly, it was a confirmation of his character. A person who steals is bad enough, but a person who assumes you are too dim-witted to notice is a special kind of arrogant. I didn't shout. I didn't call him to confront him. Instead, I did what I do best. I started the audit. I went to the home security hub in my study. I rarely looked at the digital logs, but I knew they were there. As a forensic accountant, I know that everything leaves a footprint. We live in an age where silence is rare and data is constant. I pulled up the access logs for the safe and the house-wide security system. The screen flickered to life, showing the timeline of the past 3 weeks. I spent hours sitting in the dark of my study, tracking the movements. There it was, a log entry for 3 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. The master bedroom safe had been accessed. The system allowed for a manual override using a passkey, and the logs clearly indicated that my son-in-law had used his temporary authorization. The system was designed to notify me via email of any high-security access, but the notification had been deleted from my inbox. I checked the deleted items folder, and there it was. A simple instruction to clear the trash, which Mark had clearly forgotten to execute. It was such a small, trivial error, the kind of mistake that amateurs make when they think they are invisible. He hadn't thought to scrub the cloud backup. I sat back in my leather chair, listening to the hum of the air conditioner. I wasn't feeling anger. I was feeling a cold, clinical sense of clarity. But I needed more than just a timestamp. I needed the motive, and I needed to see where the assets had gone. Over the next few days, I observed Mark. He would come over for dinner, carrying himself with a new, swaggering confidence. He started wearing a watch that I didn't recognize, an expensive, high-end piece that clearly didn't fit his current salary bracket. During dinner, he made a comment about a performance bonus at his firm. I let him talk. I listened to his justifications, his casual mentions of market success, and his exaggerated stories about high-stakes deals. All of it was noise. I knew his company. I knew their fiscal calendar. Their third quarter had ended in a massive deficit, and layoffs were already being rumored. There was no bonus. There was only the cash he had laundered from my wife's legacy. I started digging into his digital footprint. I checked the local pawnshop registries, which are public records for anyone who knows where to look. It took me 3 hours to find the transaction. There was a record of a sale of high-value gold and diamond items, matching the description of my wife's collection, dated 2 days after the security log access. The amount he received was a fraction of the actual value, pennies on the dollar. He was desperate, and he was foolish. He had sold irreplaceable memories to a pawn shop for a quick payout to cover debts that he was too ashamed to admit to, or perhaps debts he had incurred through bad habits he thought he could keep hidden. As I compiled the evidence, I realized that I wasn't just investigating a thief. I was looking at the destruction of a man's future. He thought he was free because he had managed to get away with it for a few weeks. He didn't realize that the walls of the audit were already closing in. He had left a trail of breadcrumbs, and I was going to follow every single one of them. I had the logs, I had the pawnshop receipt, and I had the timeline, but I didn't want him to know it yet. I wanted him to feel comfortable. I wanted him to believe that he had won, because there is no greater leverage in a confrontation than the silence of a man who knows exactly how the story ends. The investigation was not about finding evidence. It was about building a structure of truth that Mark could not dismantle. Most people, when they suspect a betrayal, jump to confrontation. They scream, they argue, they demand answers. That is the quickest way to lose the upper hand. In my line of work, we don't argue with liars. We provide them with the evidence they cannot deny, and then we let the consequences do the work for us. I spent the next few days acting the part of the frail, recovering man. I would sit in the living room with a book, watching Mark as he paced around the house, checking his phone, and stealing glances at me when he thought I wasn't looking. He was nervous, but he was also smug. He had convinced himself that he had pulled off the perfect crime. He didn't know that every room he walked into was essentially a witness to his greed. I started by calling the jeweler who had custom-made my wife's engagement ring 30 years ago. I didn't tell him why I was calling. I simply gave him the appraisal documentation I had stored in my private files, including the unique serial number etched into the band. It's the kind of detail that thieves ignore. They see a ring. They see gold and a stone. They don't see the history, and they certainly don't understand the registry. The jeweler confirmed that a ring matching that description had been presented at a high-end pawn shop in the city just 3 days after my hospital admission. I had the name of the shop, the time of the transaction, and the identity of the person who signed the intake form. Mark hadn't even bothered to use a fake name. He had used his own driver's license. It was the arrogance of a man who felt untouchable. With that piece of the puzzle secured, I moved to the digital records. I didn't need a hacker to break into his accounts. I only needed the information he had willingly put into our shared household network. Mark had been using my home Wi-Fi to manage his personal financial affairs. When I accessed the router logs, I saw exactly what I was looking for. There was a clear, time-stamped connection from his phone to the online banking portal. The logs showed the exact moment the money from the pawn shop was deposited into his personal checking account. But he made a fatal error. He moved a portion of those funds into a betting site within minutes of the deposit. He was chasing losses, trying to win back what he had already squandered. He wasn't just a thief. He was a desperate gambler who was drowning in a sea of his own making. I sat in my office late into the night, printing every document, every log, and every confirmation. I organized them into a heavy, black leather folder. I placed the pawn shop receipt on top, followed by the bank statements, and then the security system access logs. It was a complete dossier of his downfall. Every page was a testament to his stupidity. I looked at the signatures on the pawn shop documents. His handwriting was sloppy, rushed, and careless. It was the signature of a man who didn't think he would ever have to answer for his actions. I felt a strange sense of satisfaction as I closed the folder. It wasn't the joy of a win. It was the quiet, cold comfort of a ledger finally balancing out. I wasn't just punishing him. I was correcting a mistake in my own life. While I compiled the evidence, I kept up the charade. I invited Mark and my daughter over for dinner twice during that week. It was a test of my own resolve. I watched him eat, listening to him make small talk about his job and the economy. He was relaxed, almost cheerful. He believed that he had escaped scrutiny because I was too preoccupied with my health. He didn't see the man across the table as an adversary. He saw me as a target, a victim who had already been taken advantage of. It is a dangerous thing to underestimate a man who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain from the truth. I noticed the way he looked at our house, the paintings, the furniture, the expensive items I had collected over a lifetime. He was already planning his next move. He was wondering what else he could take, what else he could liquidate to cover his mounting gambling debts. He was a parasite, and like any parasite, he didn't realize he was destroying the host until it was far too late. I was polite. I poured his wine. I asked about his day. I played the role of the grandfather who was just happy to have family around. Inside, however, I was already writing the ending to his story. I had the facts, I had the timeline, and I had the proof. The only thing left was to choose the moment when I would reveal the truth, not as an accusation, but as a final, irreversible audit. The game was reaching its conclusion, and Mark was the only one who didn't know the final score. The evening I chose for our final conversation was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. I invited Mark over for a drink, claiming I wanted to discuss some estate planning and long-term tax implications for my remaining assets. He arrived with that familiar, easy grin, dressed in a sharp suit that I knew he couldn't afford. He sat in the chair I offered, accepting a glass of wine with the casual confidence of a man who believes he has already won the game. He thought we were going to talk about his future, about how much of my wealth he could maneuver into his control. He had no idea he was sitting in the middle of an audit. I poured the wine slowly, ensuring the sound of the liquid hitting the crystal glass was the only thing filling the room. I didn't rush. I sat across from him, watching him swirl his drink. He was already planning his next vacation, talking about investments and opportunities, his voice full of the hollow arrogance that comes with stolen money. I let him talk. I listened to every justification, every lie, every attempt to sound like a man of substance. It is a fascinating thing to watch a predator believe he is the only one in the room with teeth. I waited for a natural pause in his monologue before I reached down and placed the black leather folder on the table between us. I didn't slide it. I placed it with a deliberate, firm movement. The sound of the folder hitting the wood was surprisingly loud. Mark stopped talking, his smile faltering just for a second. He looked at the folder, then back at me, his eyes narrowing with a flash of suspicion. I kept my expression neutral, my face a mask of polite professional interest. I asked him, very calmly, if he was familiar with the specific tax laws regarding the disposal of high-value assets and the legal requirements for reporting capital gains. He laughed, a short, nervous sound. He tried to brush it off, dismissing it as boring paperwork, but I didn't let the subject drop. I began to speak about compliance, about the rigid nature of financial regulations, and how the system is designed to catch exactly the kind of mistakes he had made. I watched his face as I spoke. I watched the color drain from his cheeks, the arrogance being replaced by a slow, creeping realization. He didn't know what was in the folder, but he knew that a man like me, a man who spent his life auditing ledgers, would not call a meeting to discuss tax law unless he had already found the discrepancies. He tried to bluff, asking why I was bringing this up now. I simply leaned back in my chair, took a sip of my own drink, and invited him to open the folder. His hands were not steady as he reached for it. The confidence he had carried into the room had evaporated, leaving behind only the shell of a man who was suddenly very aware of his surroundings. He opened the folder, and I watched his eyes scan the pages. He saw the pawn shop receipt. He saw the serial number of my wife's ring. He saw the bank logs, the Wi-Fi connection timestamps, and the transfer records to the gambling site. The room grew colder. He didn't say a word for a long time, the only sound being the rustle of paper as he flipped through the documents. His breathing became shallow, his posture collapsing, as if the chair had suddenly become too large for him. When he finally looked up at me, the arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, pathetic fear. He started to stammer, throwing out excuses about being in debt, about it being a mistake, about how he intended to pay it back. He looked smaller, frailer, a boy caught stealing from the cookie jar, except the stakes were much higher. He wasn't just losing a job. He was looking at the end of his life as he knew it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I watched him scramble for words, watching his mind race as he tried to calculate the damage. He tried to bargain, offering to return the money, offering to walk away if I just kept this quiet. He had no leverage. He was offering to return what he had already stolen, as if it were a negotiation. I looked at him, not with hatred, but with a profound, clinical disappointment. He had traded his integrity and his relationship with my daughter for a few $1,000s and a temporary high. He was a small man who had made a small mistake, and now he had to face the consequences of the math he had refused to calculate. I let him sweat. I let the silence hang there, heavy and suffocating, until he stopped talking and just stared at the table, his head in his hands. He was waiting for me to explode, to hit him, to call the police in a rage. But I gave him nothing. I just sat there, waiting for him to finish his confession, watching the panic settle into his bones. The reversal was complete. He had come here thinking he was the hunter, and he left the room knowing he was the prey. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and there was no way for him to tilt it back. He was trapped in the ledger of his own making, and the final tally was looking very grim. I watched him disintegrate in that chair. It was not a violent process, but it was absolute. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were hollow, reflecting the void of a man who realized that his safety net had been removed, not by an accident, but by a precise, calculated design. I told him then, in the same quiet, even tone I used for every other word that evening, that I hadn't called the police. I didn't need to. The police deal with the immediate chaos of a crime, but the authorities I had contacted deal with the structural ruin of a life. I explained to him that I had already filed a formal affidavit with the Revenue Service and had handed the complete file of evidence, the logs, the pawn shop receipts, the bank transfers, and the digital fingerprints, to my legal team. He tried to protest, to beg for one more chance, to weave a story of temporary hardship and misguided desperation. But the truth has a weight to it that excuses cannot lift. I simply stood up, smoothing out my jacket, and told him that my responsibility was to the ledger, not to him. He was a variable I had accounted for, and then removed from the equation. There was no room for negotiation. The documents were already in motion, traveling through the channels where they would do the most damage to his career, his credit, and his future. He wasn't just facing a theft charge, he was facing a comprehensive financial audit that would uncover every corner of his life where he had cut corners or falsified figures. It was the end of his professional existence. My daughter found out, not because I screamed the truth at her, but because the truth was eventually unavoidable. I didn't need to manipulate the narrative. I simply left the documents on the table for her to see, the same way I had presented them to him. She is sharp, and she knows my character. When she saw the evidence, the reality of who her husband was crystallized instantly. It wasn't the theft of the jewelry that hurt the most. It was the realization that the man she had built her life with was a fraud in every sense of the word. She didn't come to me looking for comfort. She came to me in silence, the same silence that now defined our home. She saw the math of her own life, and she made the only calculation that mattered. She left him. She didn't need a lecture from me. The facts did all the speaking required. Mark's downfall was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing erosion. His company let him go within the week as the investigations began. The public shame of the situation, combined with the legal repercussions of the tax fraud and the theft, stripped him of everything he had tried so hard to build through deceit. He became a cautionary tale, the kind of person people warn each other about. He had wanted the lifestyle of a man of substance, but he lacked the substance itself. He had tried to buy his way into a life he hadn't earned, and in the end, he lost the very foundation upon which he stood. In the weeks that followed, the house slowly regained its order. The silence was no longer a heavy, oppressive thing. It was peaceful, the kind of stillness that returns when the books are finally balanced. I spent my days in my study, reading and reflecting, no longer looking for discrepancies or flaws. My wife's jewelry was returned, not as a collection of assets, but as the pieces of history they had always been. I placed them back in their box, ensuring each item was in its rightful place. The ledger of my life was clear again. There were no missing entries, no unaccounted for variables. People often misunderstand revenge. They think it is about anger, or passion, or the desire to see someone suffer in the same way they made you suffer. But that is an amateur's perspective. True revenge is not an act of emotion, it is an act of accounting. It is about restoring order to a chaotic world. It is about ensuring that the debt is acknowledged and the balance is restored. Mark thought he was taking things of value, but he never realized that the most valuable thing he was stealing from was his own future. He was a man who played a game he didn't understand, against an opponent who had spent his entire life mastering the rules. I learned a life lesson through this ordeal, one that I carry with me even now. We spend our lives building structures of wealth, of relationships, of reputation. We assume these structures are permanent, that they will hold under the pressure of time and circumstance. But everything is subject to the audit. Everything is subject to the cold, hard truth of the numbers. If you build your life on a foundation of lies and small-minded betrayals, eventually the figures will stop adding up. You cannot hide the truth in the margins forever. I don't look back at the situation with regret. I don't harbor bitterness toward Mark. He was merely a flawed entry in a complicated ledger, and now he is gone. I did what I had to do to protect what was mine, and I did it with the composure that a lifetime of professional discipline provided. I didn't need to yell to be heard. I didn't need to fight to win. The truth, when presented with absolute clarity and precision, is the loudest sound in any room. It has a way of silencing the noise of lies and bringing everything back into perfect alignment. As I look out the window at the quiet street, I feel a sense of completion. The account is closed, the books are balanced, and the story has reached its necessary end. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply let the facts tell the story for you. And in the end, that is all that really matters.